As the final rays of the sun melted behind the dome of St. Peter's Basilica on the evening of May 8, 2025, a sacred hush fell over Vatican City. The crowd, tens of thousands strong, stood shoulder to shoulder in the square, their eyes fixed not on the grand architecture nor on one another, but on a single narrow chimney jutting from the roof of the Sistine Chapel. Cameras zoomed in, rosaries tightened in trembling hands, and an air of expectant reverence clung to the moment like incense before an altar. For hours, nothing. Just sky, stone, and silence. Then it happened. A breath seemed to sweep through the crowd as a thin trail of white smoke spiraled into the dusky air. It danced upward like a divine signal, curling over the rooftops of Rome with the elegance of prophecy fulfilled. The square erupted, not in riotous noise, but in awe. People wept openly, strangers embraced. For those present and the millions watching across the globe, the meaning was clear. The cardinals had chosen. The world had a new shepherd. Not long after, the bells of St. Peter's rang out. Grand, solemn, unmistakable. They didn't just toll, they proclaimed. Their chimes reverberated through the Roman skyline, rolling like a celestial hymn across cobblestone alleys and ancient walls, as if all of history were bearing witness. A moment later, the balcony curtains above the square stirred. Then he appeared, clothed in white, his shoulders squared but humble, his eyes carrying not the glint of ambition, but the calm of purpose. He stepped forward into the golden glow of the evening, into history itself. The voice that followed announced a name few expected. Robert Francis Provost, an American, a missionary, a theologian, a quiet servant of the people, and now, Leo XIV. The crowd, caught between disbelief and wonder, stood stunned for a heartbeat before applause surged like a wave. Not for fame, but for faith. It was not his nationality that struck the hearts gathered in the square. It was the weight of his gaze, the serenity of his bow, the unmistakable impression that this man had been shaped not by power, but by prayer. Born on September 14, 1955, in a modest neighborhood of Chicago, Robert Provost's life began far from marble columns and crimson robes. He was raised in a family where hands were calloused from work, but Sundays were sacred, where dinners began with prayer and ended with stories of saints and sacrifice. From his earliest days, he was drawn to the silence of churches, to flickering candles, to the mystery of the altar, not as an escape but as a calling. That calling did not thunder into his life. It unfolded slowly, like a morning sun rising over the waters of Lake Michigan. He joined the Augustinian order, seeking a life of service over spotlight, of knowledge guided by humility. While his mind thrived in Rome's theological institutions, it was in the dust of northern Peru where his soul found its home. There, among the poor, the abandoned, and the forgotten, he lived the gospel not with words but with wounds shared. He walked on foot from village to village, carried medicine, heard confessions in the shade of banana trees, baptized babies in broken fountains, and buried the dead when no one else came. He spoke Spanish with the fluency of love, with the accent of someone who listened before he spoke. Over the years, he became a figure of trust, a pillar of quiet faith in communities the church had too often passed over. In 2014, he was named Bishop of Chiclín, Peru, a position he accepted not as promotion, but as permission to love more deeply. He slept in simple quarters, wrote his own homilies by hand, and often walked without escort. His leadership was a blend of gentleness and grit. He was not afraid to speak against injustice, but never did so without first sitting down to listen. By the time Pope Francis appointed him as prefect of the dicastery for bishops in 2023, many within the Vatican knew him not by his titles, but by his silence. He rarely gave interviews, declined personal praise, and prayed often in the back of chapels, not the front. His decisions regarding new bishops were often rooted in one question: is he close to his people? When the time came for the conclave, few mentioned his name on camera. But within the walls of the Sistine Chapel, among the red-robed cardinals steeped in contemplation and prayer, his name began to rise, not by campaign, but by conviction. He was a man not molded by Rome, but by the edges of the world, a man of simplicity, a man who still rose before dawn to pray, who still carried in his pocket a rosary worn thin from decades of use. And so, when he stepped onto that balcony, the church did not see an administrator. They saw a shepherd, a man who had followed Christ into the margins and now stood ready to lead, not with dominance but with devotion. What followed in the square was not frenzy. It was something deeper, something quieter, a peace that passed through the crowd like an invisible tide. As he looked out, not down upon the faithful, bowed his head and asked for their prayers, a stillness fell, one that felt not like an ending but the beginning of something new, something holy. Because behind that gentle gaze stood a truth few yet realized. Leo XIV had not come to change the church's image. He had come to rekindle her soul. If this message touched your heart, we invite you to walk with us. Like this video and subscribe to our channel. You're not just joining a channel. You're becoming part of a community that seeks peace, light, and purpose in a world that often forgets them. Tell us your name and city in the comments. We'd love to welcome you personally. The morning after his election, the world awoke to headlines. Across continents and time zones, front pages declared the rise of the first American pope. But few could capture what was actually unfolding within the walls of the Vatican. Inside, Pope Leo XIV had risen long before the sun, quietly walking the halls of the Domus Sanctae Marthae, the same modest guest house he had chosen to remain in, rejecting the lavish papal apartments not as an act of rebellion, but of fidelity to a rhythm of life he had long embraced. He entered the small chapel alone, just before the first light touched the marble floors. There, in the dim flicker of candles, he knelt. No cameras, no advisors, just the successor of Peter in silent communion with the one he served. In that stillness, the new pontiff entrusted the weight of 1 billion souls to the pierced hands of Christ. He asked not for strength to rule, but for grace to love. And that, quietly, began to change everything. By midday, Vatican staff noted something unusual. Pope Leo XIV declined formal meetings, delaying all interviews, press releases, and public addresses. Instead, he wandered through the offices asking names, inquiring about families, thanking cooks, guards, janitors. His presence was disarming, not due to charisma, but due to the deep stillness that followed him like a shadow. His smile was soft, his steps unhurried. But his eyes saw through pretense. They saw people. On his second day, he requested a private audience not with world leaders or diplomats, but with a group of disabled pilgrims from Latin America visiting Rome through a small diocesan initiative. The Vatican aides scrambled to adjust protocols. Leo didn't care. When he entered the room, he walked past the podium, knelt beside a young boy in a wheelchair, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are strong," he whispered. The boy's mother wept. No press was allowed, but word spread like wildfire, not because of spectacle but because of sincerity. Those who were there didn't leave with autographs. They left with hope. Within the Vatican bureaucracy, there was quiet astonishment. Leo's leadership style was not managerial. It was incarnational. He did not begin his papacy with grand theological declarations. He began with presence. And that presence pierced walls long hardened by routine. In his meetings with officials from the Roman Curia, he posed questions that surprised even the most seasoned cardinals. He asked not about statistics, but about stories. How are our seminarians in Syria doing? Has the bishop in Congo been able to visit the refugee camp? Is there a priest walking with the widows in northern Ukraine? He was not trying to impress. He was trying to understand. And behind every question was a priest who had once slept on floors in mission chapels, who had held starving children and prayed beside broken mothers in the Andes. He had not forgotten their faces. Soon, bishops from every corner of the globe began to receive handwritten notes, short, direct, and filled with encouragement. One bishop in a war-torn area of Nigeria found a letter on his desk, signed with the papal seal. It read, "I am praying for your courage. Your suffering is not hidden from God." It was not bureaucracy. It was brotherhood. At his first public Angelus, when the faithful gathered once again in St. Peter's Square, Leo XIV did not speak of politics, reform, or doctrine. He spoke of Emmaus, the journey of two disciples walking in grief, unsure, until Christ walked beside them, breaking open the scriptures and their hearts. He said the church, too, was on a road like Emmaus, disoriented, burdened, unsure of the next steps. But the answer, he said, is not in strategy. It is in presence. It is in breaking bread again with Christ. The words were simple, but they struck like thunder. Bishops around the world called it a spiritual reset. Priests wept. Lay people listened. There was no performance, only truth. His early days were not marked by proclamations, but by invitations to silence, to mercy, to holiness. And in an age drowning in opinions, this quiet clarity felt like a miracle. Inside the Vatican, he had begun inviting monks, nuns, and missionaries to dine with him, simple meals in simple rooms. He wanted to hear their thoughts. One evening, a cloistered nun who had spent 50 years in prayer said softly, "Holiness is hidden." Leo smiled and replied, "Then let us go lower where God listens closely." Even his use of media shocked many. There were no hashtags, no flashy edits. When a short video was released of Leo XIV praying silently before the Eucharist, 5 minutes, no words, no music, it was viewed by millions. Why? Because in an age of noise, stillness speaks. And so, from the balcony to the back pew, something was shifting. People began kneeling again, not out of fear, but desire. The church was no longer speaking louder, it was breathing deeper. But not everyone welcomed this change. Inside some corners of the Vatican, murmurs began. Some feared the slowness. Others misunderstood the stillness. Power resists simplicity. And while Leo carried no sword, his presence alone began to challenge old rhythms. What none yet realized was that the Pope had not come to battle against the institution. He had come to resurrect its soul. And in the soft beating of that soul, something else was quietly awakening. By the third week of his papacy, the world had begun to adjust to Pope Leo XIV's rhythm, a pace more contemplative than ceremonial, more pastoral than political. The grandeur of the office remained as it must, but it now moved with a quieter gravity. The man in white was not chasing visibility. He was inviting presence. And that presence was beginning to seep into corners of the church long untouched by central authority. In a private audience with a group of young Catholic leaders from 5 continents, Leo stood without script or formality. "I do not ask you to admire the church," he said gently. "I ask you to help her remember who she is." There was silence. And then tears, some visible, others inward. These were not just words. They were an invitation to rebuild not with stone, but with witness. Across the globe, something unexpected began to take root. Youth groups started reviving practices once considered outdated: adoration, silence, handwritten letters to the poor. In a coastal town in Brazil, young Catholics met weekly not to discuss social media trends, but to pray the liturgy of the hours together, inspired by a single phrase from Leo. Time spent with God is never lost, it becomes eternal. In rural France, a retired carpenter who had left the church decades earlier returned to Mass after seeing a photo of the Pope bowing in front of a simple wooden cross. "He bowed to something greater," the man said, "and I wanted to remember what that was." In Alaska, a tiny parish live-streamed Leo's Angelus every Sunday, not for spectacle, but for the stillness it carried. Parishioners sat quietly even after the screen went dark, hearts moved not by novelty, but by nourishment. Behind all this was a man who refused to center the church around himself. In fact, when a communications official suggested launching a global Leo XIV campaign to inspire engagement, the Pope declined. "We do not evangelize with our names," he said. "We evangelize with our lives." Instead, he began sending handwritten letters, not mass emails, not polished press statements, but letters, into communities most would never see. To cloistered nuns in Syria, he wrote, "Your silence strengthens the church more than you know." To a small Catholic school in Uganda, "Your laughter is the sound of hope." To a dying priest in Argentina, "You have carried the cross. Christ will carry you home." Each note, each word was crafted with the care of a soul fully present. Inside the Vatican, he had already begun subtle reforms, not structural overhauls but spiritual renewals. He introduced what he called spiritual audits of seminaries and religious houses. Instead of metrics, he wanted silence. "Let us not ask how many priests we are forming," he said. "Let us ask, are we forming men who pray?" He sent monks and mystics, spiritual mothers and retired missionaries to walk quietly through these places. They did not inspect, they listened. And what they found was a hunger for depth, a thirst for something more than efficiency. In many places, young men and women longed not for authority, but for authenticity. In response, Leo began encouraging bishops to lead retreats, not administrative ones, but Eucharistic ones. He invited them to leave behind their schedules and sit, even for a few days, in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. "You cannot feed others," he reminded them, "if you have forgotten the taste of grace." In one such retreat held in a simple mountain monastery, an archbishop reportedly wept through an entire morning meditation. "I had forgotten," he confessed, "how to love without performing." It was not just the clergy who felt this shift. Lay people, too, began to see the change. Parishes quietly simplified. Websites were redesigned not to impress, but to invite. Mass times were made clearer, confession hours more accessible. Some churches even left their doors open later at night with only a candle lit near the tabernacle. People came, not in droves but in ones and twos, drawn by something they could not explain. It was as if stillness had become the new evangelization. Even in the digital world, Leo's vision took root. He encouraged young Catholic creators, not influencers but witnesses, to use beauty and silence in their work. "Don't try to be viral," he told them. "Be visible to God." Soon, small online projects began blooming. Short films about saints, reels of Eucharistic adoration, digital rosary circles in multiple languages. One young filmmaker in the Philippines released a 2-minute video. No voice, no music, just people lighting candles in a dark church. It was shared over 1 million times. Why? Because it made people pause. And in that pause, hearts remembered. The Pope's vision was clear. The church does not grow by shouting. It grows by listening, deeply, tenderly, courageously. He saw evangelization not as conquering but as accompanying, not as correcting, but as connecting. One afternoon, during a quiet walk through the Vatican gardens, a journalist asked him, "What is your goal for the church?" Leo XIV stopped, turned slowly, and said, "To make her a place where the wounded feel safe enough to hope again." He said nothing more. But in those few words, the heart of his mission was revealed. Not a church obsessed with survival, but one ready to surrender again to grace. And somewhere, in a dusty chapel in South America, a young seminarian read those words and began to dream. By the end of his first year, Pope Leo XIV had not built monuments, launched global initiatives, or issued grand encyclicals that stirred political waves. What he had done was far more difficult and far more enduring. He had begun a renewal of the heart. From bustling metropolises to the most hidden corners of the world, echoes of his silent revolution were being felt. In Manila, seminarians were gathering weekly in candlelit chapels to pray in silence, together, yet without speaking. In a village in Poland, a grandmother who hadn't attended Mass in decades returned to the sacraments after watching a simple clip of the Pope blessing a child with Down syndrome. In war-ravaged regions of the Middle East, priests risked their lives to distribute handwritten reflections of Leo's words, pages folded, passed in secret, and clutched like gold. But the Pope himself remained unchanged. He still rose before dawn, still prayed with the flicker of a single candle, still walked the Vatican halls as if they were sacred corridors leading not to power, but to presence. His final address of the liturgical year was delivered not in St. Peter's Square, but inside a small Roman parish that had long been overlooked. There were no cameras allowed, only the parishioners, their worn wooden pews, and the Pope. When he stepped up to the ambo, his voice was almost a whisper. "I did not come to lead the church to success," he said. "I came to remember with her what holiness tastes like. It tastes like bread broken for others. It tastes like tears not hidden, like prayers whispered when no one is watching. It tastes like Christ." And then he paused. The silence in the church was alive. "Do not be afraid to be small," he continued. "Do not be afraid to be forgotten. The seed that falls into the ground and dies, it does not vanish. It multiplies." He did not speak of numbers. He did not cite trends. He spoke of hearts, of witness, of the kind of beauty that doesn't age and cannot be manufactured, the beauty of a soul surrendered. That week, hundreds of dioceses across the globe announced new programs, not of expansion, but of interior renewal. Parishes began offering weekly holy hours again. Confession lines grew, not out of fear, but hunger. Religious communities, once dwindling, began to see postulants knock once more, not for status, but for silence. And yet Leo XIV never claimed credit. In his private journals, later published in fragments, one simple entry stood out. "If I have done anything, it was to kneel. If the church rises, it will be because she remembered how." He had not built a kingdom. He had opened a door, and through that door, countless souls had begun to pass. By his second Christmas as Pope, a new energy pulsed through the church, not loud, not boastful, but steady, glowing like embers. From the elderly in retirement homes to teenagers in noisy cities, from cloisters in the mountains to missions in the deserts, people were rediscovering something ancient and alive. Faith, not performance, not ideology, but real, enduring faith. And perhaps that was always his secret. Leo XIV never tried to save the church. He simply reminded her who her savior was. He reminded us all. If this journey has awakened something in you, something holy, something tender, we invite you to stay with us. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel so you continue to walk with a community that believes in light, love, and renewal through faith. Comment the name of your city below so we can keep you in our prayers and send you a special blessing in our next video. You are not just a viewer here. You are part of something sacred. And now, we invite you to click on the video that's appearing on your screen. It carries a message that may be glorious and life-changing for you. A revelation waiting to touch your spirit in a way only God can. Thank you for staying with us. Amen.